I invite you to take a seat. We will begin. I welcome you to this conference. My name is Marc Fleurbaey. I chair the Scientific Council for Socio-Economic Evaluation. And out of courtesy for our international guests, I will now speak in English.
So welcome to everyone today for this conference. Luc and I will give you a general introduction setting the stage for the day. And we very much look forward to this day, which will be a special occasion for brainstorming, discussions about practices, but also theoretical riddles and problems in the context of cost-benefit analysis. Okay, good. So let me present the Scientific Council, which is a new version of this expert committee, and then we'll try to motivate the day and the conference by highlighting the importance of the topic and why it is actually something that, even though sometimes it is considered to be neglected, is actually quite pervasive. And then we'll discuss a little bit these core issues having to do with the methodology, and introduce a little bit what we've learned from looking at international experience, but we'll hear much more from our colleagues here during the discussions. And then we'll talk about how we hope to launch a revision process in France. And then we'll really launch the discussions and the roundtables of this morning. Okay, so let me very briefly introduce the new Scientific Council, which is following the expert committee that was chaired by Roger Guenry from 2016 to 2024. We have eminent colleagues here. You can read their names. We also have a close link with the Secrétariat Général pour l'Investissement, something like in English it could be the General Office for Public Investment. And we are hosted by France Stratégie. This committee receives a lot of support from France Stratégie, and especially Nicolas Ridinger and Jingsheng Ni, who are here. And this is the occasion to warm them and the France Stratégie team warmly to thank them, for their help in organizing this day. We have missions which have been laid out in the official text setting up this committee. So working on the scientific quality of the publications related to the cost-benefit analysis methodology, work on special priority topics for the development and the revision of the methodology, and also look at the debates, follow the international discussions and participate in them on these issues, but also have a role of promotion of the practice, promotion of the principles in order to enhance the transparency and the rationality in the decisions that are made concerning public investment. And finally, contribute to a network of practitioners and experts in this topic. So these are the main missions. Very briefly, the list of topics we have chosen for our priority work in the coming months. The environmental impacts are still very difficult to assess, especially in some areas like biodiversity. So a lot of open issues remain in this setting. Energy, a lot of developments are taking place in the energy transition, and we are associating this theme with a theme of innovation, which is particularly difficult in the context of evaluation, given all the uncertainties that have to do with the evaluation of innovation. And we have also something to do about buildings and all the externalities linked to projects that modify the local landscape and have a lot of social impact. And finally, there is this topic of distributional impacts, which are the topic of the day, and which we launch here. We recently received a notice that it would be nice also to work on transportation, and especially the value of time, which is always a rather delicate issue, and so that is a topic that will be added to the official list of our program very soon. Okay, so I will give the floor to Luc for the discussion of the importance of the topic.
When state or local authorities undertake a major investment project, there is often much controversies in the public debate about the expected environmental and social impacts to the project. But there are also controversies, sometimes very intense, about how these impacts should be taken into account or not in the assessments. Some people argue that integrating these effects into socio-economic assessment is not only impractical, but unacceptable. In this preliminary presentation of our working session on redistributive effects, I will briefly return to the objectives of economic calculation in the public sphere. I will then use evaluations from recent years to demonstrate that these social realities are very significant and sometimes decisive in the project. But in the practice, the integration of these effects in these evaluations remains very limited, and that's a problem. What is the fundamental aim of a socio-economic assessment? It's essential to revisit the fundamentals of economic calculation and the rationale behind conducting this kind of evaluation. And you have here definitions. There is a lot of this kind of definition in all economics handbooks, but it's interesting to read it precisely. CBA is a policy assessment method that quantifies in monetary terms the value of all consequences of a policy to all members of a society. And what is the objective? The objective is, in the end, it's to answer the questions. Is this project create value or destroy social value? And there is, let me enlighten some specific parts of the practical in these studies. The first principle is to take the point of view of the collectivity, of the national community. This point very often is not really integrated in the study. It's not only individual preferences. The promoter of the project must take the point of view of the collectivity, and the leader of the project see only his own project and not very often the integration of this project in a territory, in a lot of public policy, the impact of the other actors, other populations. And it's why in France we have a value for time, for CO2, for statistical human life. Why? Because we want to put in these studies the effort the collectivity is ready to make to improve the situations. Other principles, very quickly, principles of exhaustiveness. It's important to say that an economic, socio-economic assessment must be as large as possible and must integrate all the impacts. And very often it's not the case. The principle of project comparability, it's important if you integrate an impact on the study, you do the same to all the other projects, if you don't do that, it's difficult to compare this project. The third principle of applicability. Very often in the assessments, we have good ideas, we have theoretical ambitions, but in practice, it's difficult to integrate concretely the result of these studies in the CBA or what I just would like to finish this slide is to say that the law in France doesn't speak about CBA, but it speaks about socio-economic assessment. It is not a hazard. The objective is clearly to open as large as possible the analysis in all the projects. If you look at what is expected in this study, you have a decree we specify what an evaluation file should contain. And social impacts are not very far, in fact. If you read this point, detailed description of the investment project, variants and alternatives, very often in some projects, some options could have important impact on some part of population, for example. Relevant socioeconomic indicators, very often we speak about net present value, but in fact you can introduce a lot of indicators, and we are incited to integrate social indicators. It's possible. Public policy performance indicators, the objective of this point is to force the leader of the project to precise how the project impacts positively some public policy. And clearly, it's interesting to see if some projects have impact on social policy, for example. And risk mapping is a point very important in the study. It's not just the risk concerns not just cost or delay, but benefits. And the question is, what conditions guarantee that the project will produce the expected benefits? And very often, it's not clear, it's not guaranteed. If you have a nice hospital, but you have not place parking or transport policy deficient on the area, this impacts the quality of the services of this hospital. And in the evaluation, it's important to integrate all these dimensions to be sure that the infrastructure could produce the good services. When we speak about distributional effects, in fact, for me, I would like to enlarge the aspect. We have a lot of consideration to have on this topic. And some investment very often have highly differentiated impacts on populations. It's interesting, I think, to clarify in each study this point. Some investment contribute directly to social policy, aimed at a particular target group, for example. Most investment concern very different areas and territories with economic and social issues that are often specific. And public investment helps to reinforce social cohesion, assure, for example, the equality access to public services. So in a lot of projects, we have these questions. I've just described here some elements you find in some studies: economic situation of some category of populations, health situations, quality of life, quality of housing, quality of access to essential public utilities, and so on. What I just would like to finish this short introduction is to show you that we have now a lot of socioeconomic assessments because of the law. The law in 2012 has given an obligation to produce these studies. And it's important to see the quantity of works. No, we have not my slide with the figures. Just to tell you that in 10 years, it's more than 100 studies. And in all sectors, energy, university, hospital, culture, justice. And in each sector, that's a challenge to do this socioeconomic assessment. It's not only transportation, and we have hospital too. And the amount of investment is very high. That's more than 100 billion of euro. And in these studies, where the law obliged to produce a socioeconomic evaluation, assessment, but they obliged to a counter-expertise. And these documents are clearly introduced in public debate. All these documents are directly accessible in the public debate. So that oblige to have a high quality in this document. Because in the debate publics, all people look if you have taken into account this effect or this problem. And the counter-expertise, it's always free, and you can see at the seat of the HPE. You have a lot of commentaries, a lot of recommendations, a lot of critics about methodology. Very often, some aspects are criticized very strongly. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity, in fact, to use these works to progress in our practices. I've put this point, when you read these studies, you can see a difficulty in assessing and characterizing precisely because of lack indicators. Measures are very difficult. There is no clear reference method in the guides and recommendations. Treatment at some times proposed, but not systematically. Some approaches have been implemented, but only on an experimental basis. These first approaches are hampered by the lack of recognized methodologies, sector studies, and French data. When monetization is specified, it's very difficult to say if it's possible or not to integrate it in the net present value. And there were a lot of questions similar to this. So just to finish, to show you how in a study you can have a lot of debates on some social impacts. Just to focus on the first proposition, operation of national interest to redevelop degraded condominiums or garden. That's really important investment. It's a large-scale urban operations to combat unworthy housing, unsanitary housings. In generally, for the states, that involves to destroy and rebuilding an entire urban neighborhood and redeveloping the entire urban. The cost is very high. And if the state decides to do this, to undertake this operation, it's because the social cost of do nothing is very high. And in these studies, the researchers have tried to identify, to quantify, and to monetize a lot of aspects. It's interesting, it's fragile, but it's interesting. Poverty reduction, improvement of the living environment, attractivity of the territory, improvement of people's health, improvement of children's schooling, reduction of crimes on delinquency, impact of insecurity, impact of load on land values, and so on. And you have some examples of these studies. It's fragile, but that exists. And we have two studies on this topic, and we observe a progress, important progress between these two studies. We can progress on this topic. To conclude, just to focus on some points, I think that an socio-economic assessment should not focus solely on the NPV. And that implies, in fact, to create systematically a clear list of impacts and to identify them, and to try to not only have qualitatively commentaries on this topic, but to try to quantify, when it's possible, to give an economic value. But the problem is really to disaggregate the NPV to show how it impacts different categories of population, for example, different territories. Second point is that the net present value very often is only the sum of prices multiplied by quantities. And the debate very often is on the value. What is the value? Why this value are not another one? But in fact, in the studies, very often the problem is not the value, the problem is the quantity. And to define this quantity is not just a problem of economics analysis. You have to discuss with a lot of other scientists, science of life, science of engineers, and so on. And the first point, clearly, is to say that if you want to progress, clearly we have to improve theoretical problematics, but we must in mind that it's important to integrate very easily the results in an ACB, or in socioeconomic assessment. And very often we have a lot of proposition, but it's not easy to integrate in the studies. So just to tell you that this value, these references are a necessity, even if it's fragile, if modest. And we have to put the first step and to progress on it. These values, these standards are not defined once and for all, and the work is never finished. And I'm sure that this day is the opportunity to progress on this topic, and next year we have some ideas to integrate directly in some works. Thanks. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, so we are all on the same wavelength in the sense that practical applications are very important. And nevertheless, I will discuss a little bit going back to the core methodology and because we need to have practice to rest on solid foundations. And are the foundations solid? Well, that's the question. And in fact, we could even say that the core of cost-benefit analysis is often the target of severe criticism, and for good reasons, potentially. So as you all know, the practice comes from a theory that relies on very old concepts going back to the first half of the 20th century, when Kaldor and Hicks proposed the compensation, the so-called compensation test, namely, can the winners compensate the losers, and this sort of idea, in order to go beyond the analysis that just looks at reforms that benefit everyone, how to do when we have winners and losers. And so the compensation test is the idea that if the winners could compensate the losers, then we are on good grounds to move forward with the project. And so there are many problems potentially with this approach. Let me focus really on the main one. So essentially 3 problems. One is quite obviously that this idea is implying that a dollar is a dollar, as they say, meaning that it doesn't matter who receives the benefits and who suffers the costs. It's only the sum that matters, and the distribution is essentially ignored, right? And so this is, of course, quite shocking to many people who see potential applications and biases coming from that. So what if the winners are actually the rich part of the population and the losers are in the poor part of the population, and the compensation that is the basis of the story is just completely virtual and doesn't actually take place, right? So that's the first criticism. The second criticism, which is less known to practitioners but familiar to the core theorists, is that this approach is actually irrational in the sense that it can lead to cyclical decisions. So you can have a sequence of reforms which are all deemed to be an improvement on the previous situation, and they go back to the initial point. And that is something that indeed is quite problematic for an approach that is supposed to rationalize public decisions. That's something that is sometimes considered just as a theoretical possibility, but there are some examples where this thing is not just a theoretical curiosum, it could really happen in some context. And finally, there is something that very often non-economists mention and raise against this whole approach, is that everything is monetized and everything is given a price, even life, even health, and this sort of thing. And this is considered to be quite shocking for many non-economists. So I hope I won't be too provocative here, but let me frankly say that I believe, and I think we most believe, that the third problem is a red herring. It's not really a problem. There is indeed some difficulty in making things commensurate, but as soon as people are willing to make trade-offs between different dimensions, then the rod, the unit of measurement that is used, could be monetary, could be something else. It's not really the point. As soon as people are willing to make trade-offs, then we are on firm grounds to translate changes in one dimension into changes in another dimension. And so computing willingness to pay in money is something that makes sense as soon as trade-offs are possible. Willingness to pay in other things could be used, for instance, in longevity or things like that. Money is quite convenient. And so, and especially, there should not be a confusion about the fact that using money as a measuring rod, as a measuring unit, doesn't mean that we are using commodification, that we are setting up markets for these things, right? So that's a very different consideration. Okay, so if we move beyond this third problem, there are still the first 2 problems. And what is interesting, if you go back to the theory, is that they are actually simultaneously, jointly solved by one approach, which actually appeared around the same time as the compensation test, very much in the same decade. Bergson and Samuelson proposed the concept of a social welfare function, and that is something that is a criterion, potentially represented by a function, and they really showed that this was an approach that was the only one that will make the evaluation depend on the distribution of well-being in the population, and will respect the fact that we want to promote the well-being of the components of the population, and that is consistent in the sense that it avoids cycles. Okay, that's the only approach that will satisfy this. And so a social welfare function, when you use a function to represent this criterion, will have this shape, which is very familiar to most economists. So, okay, a function that depends on the distributions of these well-being levels, usually called utilities in the economist lingo. Now, how does this social welfare approach differ from the standard, from the classical cost-benefit analysis approach? In fact, it doesn't differ much, and that's interesting. If you look at small projects, which are only incremental at the scale of society, it only requires putting weights in front of the willingness to pay that is aggregated in the computation of a net present value of a project, right? And these weights will reflect what is called the marginal social value of money of the populations that are considered, and this is indeed weights which should depend on the conditions in which the populations are. These conditions change as we implement several sequential reforms, and by doing this adaptation to the situation of the populations, we avoid the cycles, and also by allowing the possibility to put greater weights on the willingness to pay of poor people, we avoid the potential bias in favor of the rich, right? And so this is something that is apparently quite obvious and easy, and it's quite old, but we need to promote this notion probably a bit more. There is some recent, actually the concept is not recent, but some recent developments looking at what is called the marginal value of public funds, which is now something that is popular and which assesses whether a project improves on the status quo. The marginal public value of public funds is something that is comparing different projects and how the money used in different projects can enhance social welfare. And this is good when we have to compare different projects. The cost-benefit analysis method is actually focused rather on assessing whether a project is an improvement on the status quo. And so this is a limitation of the standard method, indeed, and it's good to go, and Luc already mentioned this issue, it's good to go beyond just assessing whether something is good or bad. We need to be able to compare different projects. But there is no opposition between the two approaches, in the sense that social welfare remains the basis of the marginal value of public funds, and every project in this approach must be assessed by looking at the marginal social value of the impacted people and use that as a weight that is put in front of the value of public funds when we compute this value only in terms of aggregate willingness to pay. So it's a sort of, so you have the average willingness to pay for the project times the average weight of the people that are affected by this project, and you need both in order to compare projects. So the two approaches are really completely consistent. Now, let me finish this discussion of the core concepts by discussing a few objections. So I would distinguish between weak objections and strong objections that make our life a little bit more complex. So the first one is that weighting is rarely done and is something that is pie in the sky, if you wish. In fact, it is always done, and that is the paradox of the situation. It is always done because social discounting is, the social discount rate is one example of this approach and is used quite uniformly. And so it's a bit paradoxical that on one hand, weights are considered to be a fancy object, and on the other hand, they are used all the time when it's about intertemporal settings, right? So there's a sort of inconsistency in our usual practice. The other criticism or worry is that weights are arbitrary. In fact, this is not true. The weights can be discussed, and there are various approaches, quite standard, that can be used to develop these weights. And of course, it has to involve the choice of particular measure of individual well-being in order to compute the marginal value of marginal social value of money. But there are different approaches: objective, subjective, preference-based, and so all of them can be considered. And there are considerations that can help in the selection of coefficients of inequality aversion. And so there are shortcuts that are often in the guidelines proposed in various countries that rely directly on income, and they are actually not so bad. And it's interesting to look at how the shortcuts are close to our good approximations of the more complete theory. A last objection is that cost-benefit analysis should be about efficiency and should be kept separate from equity. This is, of course, problematic because we live in a second best or even maybe a 10th best world with a lot of imperfections in which, well, the projects, when they change the distribution, when they affect the distribution, they have to be evaluated also at the bar of equity and not just at the bar of how they affect the efficiency allocation. So we cannot really separate the two issues in practice. Okay, now I'll go back a little bit to what Luc was saying, repeating some of the ideas. There are indeed some complications. First, the distributional impacts may be hard to estimate, and especially when they involve general interactions like general equilibrium effects on price, wages, and so on, or multiple externalities which are hard to figure out. There are things which are also very diffuse and not so easy to attribute to individuals or to subpopulations in a very specific way. When you talk about, so Luc was giving the example of a museum, for instance, when you talk about cultural effects, well, how do you attribute that to specific populations? But there are also deontological issues, dignity and rights, which are sometimes quite important in how people perceive the impact of a project. And of course, the beautiful social welfare function is conceived for a population that is well identified, but many projects have impacts on nature, on future generations, on essentially unknown entities, or at least entities for which we don't know the willingness to pay, or that don't have a willingness to pay, like other species, for instance. There might be problems when, at a large scale, when you have a program of policies, they may actually change the willingness to pay of the population, even change the culture of the population. And then this kind of shaping of a population is something that is not so easy to evaluate with the standard approach. In the standard economic model, individuals come with well-defined preferences, completely stable, completely rational, but this is not exactly the world we are living in. Finally, and along the same vein, behavioral studies have shown that preferences are actually not well defined. They may not even totally exist in people's mind. And so how do we deal with these behavioral biases that we observe? And finally, there is the issue of using uniform values instead of using weights. So for instance, the value of life or the value of time could be something that is used uniformly in order to avoid giving greater weight to, for instance, the life of the rich or the time of the rich. And this is something that may be quite convenient and sometimes a valuable approximation. Okay, so just to draw some tentative lessons from this, applying differential weights to various impacted populations has solid foundation, so at least we know the theory is there and may be feasible in some cases, so don't drop this as something that's too complicated. It could be considered and sometimes applied, but we should remain aware of the difficulties and limitations in the data on impacts and on the monetized preferences. And so that's why, as Luc was saying, it's important not just to compute the net present value in some fancy fashion, but also to keep track of the more qualitative or disaggregated data on the distributional impacts. Okay, I will be short because we'll learn from our colleagues here who came from various countries, but we've looked a little bit at various guidance, and we also interviewed two colleagues from the USA, Zachary Lisko and Eli Fenichel, who were involved in the revision of the guidelines in 2023 in the previous administration of the US, and who have given us some interesting insights about how the revision was performed. And so if we look at what we find in the various guidelines, actually it's quite rare. So there are not many places in the world where the distributive impacts are explicitly introduced in the guidelines, and methodology for the integration is really described. And there is an open question that I want to ask all our colleagues here. Do you know an example where an NPV, a net present value, incorporating quantitatively distributional impact has really been done and had an impact on the decision? That's an open question for our colleagues, especially in our interviews with Zachary Lisko, he said he has done a lot of research on the literature, never found an example of such a study. So that's an open question I wanted to raise now. Nevertheless, there are some countries in the world where we find, including very specific, precise suggestions about how to introduce weights. The UK is famous for having done that for a long time. In the European guidelines, you do find that they don't have much of a mandatory impact, so they are just an option. So they don't have a big impact, but you have similar guidelines there. And the revised circular in the US, both the one for regulation and the one for public investment, they have introduced the possibility of using these equity weights that I was describing. They also mentioned the possibility of using uniform values. So this is there. Of course, I mean, you know that turmoil happening in the US now, so these circulars are a bit in a limbo, but now they are there at least for the history. But these are rare cases, and they don't really discuss how to choose the ethical parameters, the key ones, the question of inequality aversion, and how to compute the well-being of the people. So they essentially propose something that is kind of utilitarian approach based on the sum of well-being, sum of utilities, and they derive the weights only from a notion of diminishing marginal utility, not from an ethical coefficient of aversion to inequality. And so, but the other thing that we learn, especially from our interviews with the American colleagues, is that a revision process can involve a wide consultation, and it's quite fascinating. Some of us have been involved in that process, actually, to see how broad participation in this process has been really energizing the debates and the research in the field and have had an impact on the revision itself. And so we hope that here in France, we will be able to launch a similar process. So we have guidelines which have been revised in the beginning of the Guenry Committee and have been updated recently with operational supplements. They do include, as I said, distributional considerations for discounting and depending on scenarios about the growth rate, but they don't say much about other social issues. And so we plan to introduce such considerations in the next revision. And really this day is the first, is the launch of this process of revision, and we hope to learn a lot from the discussions today. So this is an open call. Any suggestion, advice, please pass the word. People can contact us and give us some ideas, either the members of the council or the people at France Stratégie who are helping us. Okay, so let me just close with the program of the day, of the morning, actually. So we'll have two roundtables which are conceived in terms of two key issues that we have addressed briefly in these introductory remarks. First, the difficulty of assessing the impacts, what are the methodologies, and how to make sure we identify the relevant social groups, which may not necessarily just be the income strata or the income groups, but maybe more complex, involve, for instance, territorial inequalities, as Luc was highlighting. That will be the topic of the first roundtable, moderated by Kathleen Schubert. And then the second roundtable will be about this integration of distributive effect into the computation, especially the computation of a weighted net present value. And can we learn about international experience on this kind of approach, roundtable moderated by Aude Pommeret. And then we'll have closing remarks by Marc-Antoine Lacroix from the Secrétariat Général pour l'Investissement. Something maybe we didn't highlight enough is that we are really working closely between France Stratégie and the Secrétariat Général pour l'Investissement because we are keen on not just working in the ivory tower of good principles, but also we want the practice to be in line with the best principles. And that's why our friends at the Secrétariat Général pour l'Investissement are giving us a lot of hard questions and challenges that we have to address, and the exchange with them is extremely productive. So that's the exciting part of this new council. We have this close collaboration with them, and we hope that this will help produce both solid general guidelines, but also a lot of practical toolkits for all the practitioners in the ministries who have to construct these evaluations. So that's the goal. Okay, now without further ado, let me thank you for your attention, and we'll introduce the first roundtable with Kathleen. Thank you.